And today, perfect. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And today I'm delighted to introduce Lucy Darrington. She's a neuroscience master student at King's College London and will talk about motor development and executive function in childhood. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to you, Lucy. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on this talk today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to start there. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to me. Today I'm going to be talking to you about auditory lateral inhibition and coronary discharge. And I'll be looking at how dysfunction in these processes during development may influence the development of auditory hallucinations later in life. I'll be finishing up my talk by showing how these ideas are relevant to the free energy principle. Can you still see me? That's a question.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So there are consistently identifiable aspects of our own voice from our own perspective. For example, bone conduction means that we generally perceive our own voice as being deeper than those who are listening to it. Others hear our voice as being high in pitch because they hear our voice without any bone interference and as purely air-conducted sounds, which is why when we hear our voice back for the first time, it often seems unrecognizable, and disappointment is a common reaction because there is a conflict between what we expected to hear, what we are used to hearing in our heads, and what we heard in reality. There is also a consistency of tone to the voice inside our heads, unless we intentionally manipulate our speech, during sarcasm, for example, or to emphasize a point. When listening to others, however, there is a huge diversity to the sounds we must interpret. Each individual we listen to has a unique texture to their voice and their own fundamental frequency, also known as pitch. On top of this, we have to balance environmental sounds, such as cars or animals, with talking and listening to others talk. For example, during a peaceful meditation class, it makes it much easier for you to recognize your own voice in others, whilst at a busy party, distinguishing your own voice from others becomes more difficult. All of this means that our brains must process a cacophony of noises with differing pitches and complexity, and effectively processing both our own voice and other sounds and voices, so that the world makes sense to us. Efference copies and coronary discharge, I must apologize, I'm very bad at pronouncing that word, help in the process of distinguishing self-generated sounds from external sounds by sending predictions of our actions and speech to the appropriate cortex and cancelling any sensory consequences of our actions, so that when we speak, we're not surprised by the sound of our own voice. However, in order for the coronary discharge to work effectively, we must first be able to effectively distinguish between the sounds produced by ourselves and the sounds that others produce. And so others, that in development, coronary discharge can accurately tag and identify our own voices. This is where lateral inhibition comes in. Lateral inhibition is commonly controlled by either parvalbumin or somatostatin-containing interneurons, and occurs when one active neuron is able to inhibit the activity of its surrounding neurons. In the visual cortex, lateral inhibition helps to emphasize edges and contrast, such as a dark spot in a white background. In the auditory cortex and cochlea, lateral inhibition helps to enhance the contrast between two sounds and sharpen the frequency tuning of neurons. Using the cocktail party effect discussed earlier, lateral inhibition helps us to distinguish between the various sound frequencies that the large array of voices produce, and allows us to focus on our friends talking to us, rather than becoming overwhelmed by all the voices in the room. Tonotopic maps organize sound frequencies within the auditory cortex and cochlea, and rely on tuning neurons to be able to distinguish between different frequencies so that the correct organization occurs. Thus, my interest lies in whether lateral inhibition, in this case, the ability to effectively highlight changes in sound frequencies, may impact the efficiency of chorally discharge during speech development. To make sure that the efference copies and chorally discharge learns which sounds are related to self and others, we must highlight some sounds and inhibit others to help create a precision gain of the sensory information being processed. When babies learn to babble and this develops into speech, lateral inhibition may therefore help to reduce any interfering noise and highlight our own voice, thus distinguishing our own voice from others. Another way in which lateral inhibition may impact the development of chorally discharge mechanisms is because of studies which have found sound frequencies play a role in sense of agency. For example, studies such as Ohata et al. Have found that changing either the formant frequency or the fundamental frequency on playback of a voice have found sound frequencies play a role in a sense of agency. For example, studies such as Ohata et al. Found that changing either the formant frequency or the fundamental frequency on playback of voice reduced the suppression of the N1 response, a measurement which has been found to reflect chorally discharge. There was an increase in agency when the voice heard directly matched the sound they expected, while sounds which did not match their expectations of their voice reduced their sense of agency over the words. If lateral inhibition is reduced, therefore, and our ability to distinguish between sound frequencies is reduced, we might not be able to accurately give agency to our own voice and actions because we may not recognize them as belonging to ourselves, thus potentially reducing the effectiveness of the chorally discharge mechanism. Tonotopy has been found in various studies to be jumbled and inconsistent in its responsiveness to certain frequencies in the auditory cortex of individuals with schizophrenia. For example, Frangu et al. In 2019 found that individuals with schizophrenia who experienced auditory hallucinations had a tonotopic map that was either very responsive to some frequencies, such as 88 to 125 Hz, a typical range for male speech, and much more reduced responsiveness to 177 to 250 Hz, the typical range of a female voice. They noted the connections between many individuals with schizophrenia who hallucinate male rather than female voices. It is interesting to think that perhaps this is because they have a more natural tendency to hear these voices. Likewise, Rockers et al. Found similar results 20 years earlier, when he found that the tonotopic organization of the auditory cortex in individuals with schizophrenia was muddled and inconsistent in its responsiveness to certain tones and frequencies. Given that, in order for the tonotopic maps to appropriately organize sound frequencies, reduced lateral inhibition early in development may inhibit effective tonotopic organizations and recognizing different frequencies. Both Pavel Baumann and somatostatin-containing interneurons have been found to be reduced in individuals with schizophrenia, and so these reductions in the auditory cortex may impact the effectiveness of lateral inhibition. Further, interestingly, a study by Asanoff et al. Found that lateral inhibition acted by suppressing recurrent circuits, and recently, ketamine, which is used for a schizophrenia model, was found by Diane et al. To act by promoting recurrent circuits in the auditory cortex, and therefore the opposite of what lateral inhibition does. Further, a study by Kulikova et al. Found that ketamine increased cortical noise. Reduced lateral inhibition may therefore help to reduce the precision of incoming auditory information, and as such, reduce the ability for chorally discharge to distinguish between self-generated and external sounds. Lateral inhibition has also been proposed to play a role in a mismatch negativity response. Gu et al. Found that lateral inhibition helped to emphasize the change in frequency in auditory oddball detecting tasks. It does this by enhancing the contrast between the tones, by inhibiting the repeated sounds, and exciting the oddball noise. Individuals with schizophrenia have often underperformed in mismatch negativity tasks. Lateral inhibition may therefore help answer for why those with schizophrenia do poorly. Predictive coding accounts say that reduced mismatch negativity responses to tones in individuals with schizophrenia represents a fault in prediction error, but if combined with lateral inhibition, the auditory cortex is unable to effectively distinguish between frequencies. This may help to answer why the precision gain of information is weak during the mismatch negativity tasks. I'm now going to talk about how lateral inhibition relates to the free energy principle. You know about this, but it helps me make things make sense. The free energy principle proposes that the brain uses predictions to minimize surprisal. And when surprisal does occur, it updates its predictions so to reduce this surprisal in future. The act of surprisal is often referred to as prediction errors. Precision weighting of prediction errors helps the brain in its efforts to update information. High precision means that the reliability of the information being processed is high, so predictions are more likely to be updated, whilst low precision has less reliable information, and as such is less likely to aid updating of predictions. Reduced lateral inhibition may cause the auditory pathway to cause precision weighting to be low due to the unreliable nature of the sounds being produced. And as such, predictions are not updated, and the auditory cortex may rely on prior predictions. Auditory hallucinations have been found to rely on strong priors. Lateral inhibition's potential role in reducing the efficiency of corollary discharge also means that individuals may not adapt appropriately to errors because of its ability to help distinguish between self-generated and external sounds is weaker. An interesting thing to bear in mind going forward, therefore, is how children may be helped to increase their auditory lateral inhibition capacity. Something such as auditory testing in early childhood could help pick up any sound frequency difficulties, which could indicate susceptibility for hallucinations. Further, if auditory processing is weak, then they may need to adapt their skills to strengthen their motor skills, which may in turn improve aspects such as the precision of corollary discharge in language. Recent research has found that motor imagery and action observation has helped to improve motor skills and development in both childhood and adulthood. Thus, using more visual aids to language acquisition may help acquire the corollary discharge relationship. I'd just like to add that, interestingly, recent studies have found that those with schizophrenia struggle to react effectively to visual illusions which involve using visual lateral inhibition, such as the Hermann grid optical illusion. So auditory lateral inhibition may also be affected. And also a recent study found that auditory lateral inhibition was dysfunctional in those with schizophrenia. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Quick unmute and a round of applause, please.
I'd just like to add to everyone that basically I learned to read again when I was 13. So I'm sorry if I didn't communicate very well. It's just like one of those things.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was brilliant. We talked a bit about it before, and that's hugely impressive. This this arc of what you've been doing before, and then obviously your journey with the struggles you had, and now where you are now. So thank you very much for this presentation. Are there any questions from anyone? Otherwise, I can just because oh yeah, there is a question. Ahmad, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. Well, I'm not a neuroscientist and I'm not familiar with a lot of nomenclature about specifically about the parts of brain, but it was still interesting for me. And I don't know if my question is relevant to your concern or your research, but it brought up a question in my mind that actually after birth, mothers usually develop a sensitivity to a specific, I think, frequencies that specific frequencies which children usually infants that make them sensitive to infants' voice, so that during the night, if they are asleep, they wake up. But this doesn't happen in men, and as far as I know, and that's brought a question in my mind that how does that happen? Is there some, as we talked about, some lateral inhibition? Does something structurally happens in the brain that in the mother's brain? I don't know if you have considered this area or have some information about it, but it was my own personal interest.
That's really interesting. No, I haven't really thought of that specifically, but I think in terms of why it probably happens, I think in terms of like hormones and that sort of thing, it kind of maybe when we fall asleep and that sort of thing, we're more kind of alert to the things around us, if that makes sense. Like if you're falling asleep next to your child or being near your child, for example, you might become much more enhanced, like because you're already thinking about your child before you fall asleep. I think there's that kind of thing where because you're more likely to hear it because it's sort of on your mind, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. But I was really thinking about how we can actually explain this change in auditory sensitivity from the perspective of actually for a Bayesian brain and prediction and actually from this perspective, I was thinking about this question.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe that's something that may need calls.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good idea. But thank you for your question. I really appreciate it, and I think it's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, I'm open to any possibilities and stuff. But I do think, I think that, there's been a lot of research recently about attention and lateral inhibition, and whether paying attention increases our ability to kind of detect changes in frequency. And that sort of thing. So they found that actually increasing your attention to, for example, in the cocktail party effect idea, the kind of, if you're paying attention to like intentionally differentiate between the sounds that you're hearing, you're much more likely to be able to kind of distinguish between them. So I think attention plays an interesting part in that whole process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, Ahmad. Do we have any more questions? Otherwise, I'll also just have a question, because I was just frantically trying to find my notes, but I can't find them anymore. Because I'm also I remember a really interesting lecture on psychosis, and obviously also what you touched upon, the idea that sort of predictions aren't accurately accounted for in that model of psychosis. And I might be mixing up a lot of things here, because I only vaguely remember. But for example, the experiment or the study where I don't know whether you know this one, but it's where lever presses were done against where you had to a force matching task, I think, where you had to match the force of a motor against your head. I think I'm explaining it very badly, and I can't.
With the sound that like matches the button pressing, that sort of thing.
So, no, I meant a specific one where you're supposed to match the force of a lever that presses up, and healthy participants typically press too much, because it's typically attenuated. I'm not explaining it very well. I'm sorry, but
I'm getting the vibe.
I'm not finding my notes at the moment. I'm sorry. But essentially, that this attenuation isn't accurately happening in, for example, schizophrenia patients, which then, for example, explains or can explain symptoms of like this feeling of alien control. So that your own actions feel as though they're influenced by an external force rather than your own. I just wonder, I just vaguely remember also in that lecture, I didn't fully understand. So that for motor actions, it makes sense to me because of the corollary discharge, and that feels like a fairly intuitive mechanism, although I'm probably not explaining it very well or accurately, that this attenuation doesn't happen properly in schizophrenia patients. But I was just wondering, and whether you maybe know more about this, how a similar sort of predictive coding account can account for inner voice in psychosis. I mean, I guess you touched on it slightly, but I was just wondering whether you would know more about the supposed mechanism, because I remember also back then it wasn't entirely clear to me how this sort of inner voice that is not understood as one's own can be explained in psychosis.
Sure, because so the kind of idea was that when we speak, there's kind of, I think, a similar kind of motor action situation where the sound of our voice is kind of used as a prediction. And when we hear our voice, the corollary discharge sort of inhibits the sound of our voice, so that when we hear it, it's kind of not an unexpected part of, when we speak. And so I'm kind of thinking that during early development, if we don't recognize the sound of our own voice, or we struggle to have that kind of connection between sounds and the corollary discharge that occurs, then basically there's a kind of gap between expected and what happens. And basically the brain and the auditory cortex relies more on our predictions, and kind of like reduces that like precision weighting of, so like the information that we receive is like much lower precision weighted. So for example, this is going to sound strange, but like as a child, if we say dog, during that speaking progress, lateral inhibition, auditory lateral inhibition, basically enhances you saying the word dog, like the sound of the word dog, and inhibits the background sound or the sounds going on around it, so that the brain essentially recognizes that sound as being your voice, whilst corollary discharge is able to, in that moment, kind of recognize that that is your voice, so that during development, as you kind of practice that, essentially, the coronary discharge is able to properly recognize that your voice is yours. But if it's over time, because of this reduction in auditory lateral inhibition, if it doesn't process your voice as being your own as well, it might kind of reduce that relationship between the coronary discharge and the kind of prediction of our voice, if that makes any sense at all.
No, I do think that makes sense, and that also brings up again sort of vague memories. I think from a paper by Fletcher and Frith from 2009, sort of a Bayesian approach, also about aberrant precision weighting in these predictions. So not necessarily that the predictions themselves are wrong, but that the precision weighting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of more of the precision weighting, because there's kind of like with hallucinations, there's sort of strong priors. So instead of, because of the lack of reliability of like the auditory information that's coming in, the idea is kind of like, well, instead of that problem, like it just relies on its kind of expectations and sort of predictions, if that makes any sense again.
No, it does, and I think I also found the study that I was referring to in the beginning. It's by Blakemore et al. In 2000 about a force matching task, which I can just share the link in the messages.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
I just thought that one was really interesting, just a mechanistic explanation.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your reply. Do we have any more questions? I'm just curious, also because you talked about sort of obviously childhood development. Sort of psychosis, typically like symptoms arise late adolescence or early, I don't know, early, like between whatever 19 and 29. Is that
Yeah,
sort of?
I think so.
Yeah.
Between like maybe like 17 onwards. Yeah.
Okay. And would you know whether like anything? Okay, that's probably difficult to. Yeah. Okay. No.
I think there's been quite, I mean, in terms of the lateral inhibition thing, there was an interesting study about arousal recently, which found that arousal, also there is the idea of dopamine kind of having
right.
a role in it, that genetic susceptibility to increase dopamine. Dopamine often kind of helps to like have those like strong prior predictions, and kind of studies have found that a strong dopamine response like helps to confirm prior predictions, and like that's how that would come into this equation, if that makes sense. But there was also one study recently that found that like high arousal and stress decreased lateral inhibition. So it could be an interesting sort of like two-hit idea, that like a susceptibility during like developmental phase, like that could be like hit one, in the sense that it's already reduced, and then like later on in development and adulthood, like big triggers are often stress for psychosis. So say like arousal, so something like arousal being increased could totally inhibit the lateral inhibition, and like that helps to kind of create that that connection.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I also remembered relation with NMDA as almost a like I don't know, on like almost prior to the dopamine, or affecting the dopamine downstream.
Yeah,
I vaguely remember reading it.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think that it's a really interesting kind of area. But yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. Amazing. No, this is really interesting. Do we have any more questions from the audience? I wish I could find my notes on this, because I remember creating a massive board on it, because I thought it was so interesting. And obviously now all my memories are super.
That's all right.
Muddled up.
I have those moments.
Great. So I'll just leave last minute for any questions. Otherwise, we can slowly hand over to Carl a little earlier than usual. But if there are no more questions for now, or maybe also Lucy, you can just maybe that will come up in a second, but maybe just share with us, I don't know, what directions you want to go into with this, or maybe also what you would want to get out of sort of this session today, so that maybe either people from the audience or Carl can sort of focus more precisely on what you would like to get out of it.
Sure. I mean, this is going to sound a bit strange, but really, am I barking up the wrong tree? Because even though there is like some really interesting, I would say kind of new, because this idea hasn't really been focused on a lot, the idea of kind of auditory lateral inhibition. And I suppose the thing I would want is to know whether it'd be an interesting idea to do that sort of like developmental thing about lateral inhibition and during development, and how that affects corollary discharge. And really, I suppose I'm asking, how would that happen, do you think? But yeah, I suppose it's a bit of a confidence thing. Like, I mean, when you're passionate about an area of interest, you perhaps get carried away with it, and then you step back and you're like, but does that actually make any sense, or is that just like a ADHD rabbit hole? if that makes any sense. But yeah, so I mean, I'm really passionate about it, and I do think it is like a genuine thing that this lateral inhibition like helps to like emphasize the difference between our speech and other people's speech. But yeah, it's whether other people think that as well, if that makes any sense.
Though then I think it's a little earlier. Speaking of sense, I think, Carl, it is time for you to chime in now.
Thank you. It's my turn now, is it?
I believe it is.
Okay. Thank you. Well, as always, I think you've covered all the sort of key themes. So let's just start at the beginning. So Lucy, so why did you have to relearn to read at age 13?
Oh, basically, when I was 13, I had a brain infection. And I could be a textbook example. Like, people have honestly debated about me whether I had is it NMDA encephalitis or something like that, or various other things, because basically I had a psychotic break, and this brain infection caused me to have like really bad cognitive issues. And then also because of the psychosis, there's the idea of the NMDA, because apparently there's an association between that brain infection and people getting kind of psychotic breaks. And yeah, so after my psychotic break, I basically was, I don't know, I had some damage. I don't want to make my sound terrible, but like, it wasn't the best time of my life. But yeah, I had to learn to read again. And I was saying before people turned up, I have a passion for children's books, because I kind of, at the age of 13, like, people were reading The Great Gatsby or Jane Eyre, and I was on like a series of unfortunate events, which, by the way, for everyone, is an iconic book. But like, that's just what happened, and yeah, I just had to learn to read again.
So did they when you said infection, was it a viral encephalitis?
Yeah, it was kind of like a viral. Well, and this is the great debate. They weren't sure whether there was like a bacterial infection that there's one, I can't remember the name of it, but essentially the bacteria, your immune system misidentifies the bacteria in your body being in your brain instead of another part of your body, and it's kind of like an autoimmune disease. So instead of attacking the bacteria in the part of your body to, it kind of gets a bit waylaid and ends up attacking your brain.
Right. Yes. No. That's why I was asking, because I mean, an autoimmune etiology would be very distinct from an encephalitis due to infection. Have you read The Brain on Fire?
No, I haven't, but I've been told that it's very good, and I've had lots of suggestions. It's just I haven't had time to read it.
Yeah, it's also something that your new chair, Professor Ed Bulmore from Cambridge, got very interested in as a differential diagnosis for psychosis, and people presenting in A&E with psychotic breaks of potentially an autoimmune or encephalitic aspect. I thought he'd written a book about it, but I may be wrong. It's certainly A Brain on Fire is a good read. Not that I read it; I don't have time to read it, but it sounds as though you should use your new reading skills to
Yeah,
indulge
exactly.
yourself. And then just return to Christoph's final question. So, what in terms of what you're hoping to get out of this feedback, are you scoping the opportunities for an MS thesis or project, or have you already written up your a thesis and you just want to make sure you got all the right references, or what stage are you at, and what kind of feedback would you find most useful?
Well, I would definitely like to use this as my MSc thesis. I was kind of at the stage where I wasn't really sure whether this is something that I kind of could use or something like that. But I definitely, if I can use it, 100% would love to use it. Yeah.
Yes, it sounded as though you were reading, so I presume you've already made some extensive notes, if not already have put something on paper.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that I've done quite a lot of research, but it sounds maybe a bit crazy, but I'm just really passionate about researching in general. Like, I think because of perhaps my personal experience with the situation, like, it's just something I'm really passionate about, and I do it for fun, if that's not a weird thing to say.
Right. Oh yes, all research should be fun. Okay, so you haven't at this stage you haven't actually written a thesis. It's more just getting all the ideas in order and the focus and the narrative and the citations and everything.
Exactly.
Now, just standing back, I mean, you covered an enormous amount of ground, ranging from sensory attenuation during the cocktail party effect, right through to neurodevelopmental issues in terms of precision-weighted prediction error minimization. You started with this focus on neurodevelopment. So can you just, in one sentence, what is the high, when you say you need confidence in order to pursue this idea, what is this idea? Is it simply that lateral inhibition is mediated by parvalbumin positive or certain fast spiking into neurons plays the functional role of precision weighting and predictive coding? Or is it that there are certain deficits and or critical phases during neurodevelopment that underwrite this process that could have manifestations later in life? What is the sort of the headline of, if you had to write a paper that was just 1,000 or 2,000 words, saying this is a new perspective on, what would it be?
Okay. Just give me a second to think, because I think that's a good idea.
You can ask Christoph to help if you can't think of.
No, I think I'll get that.
All right.
But he's more than welcome to help. Well, anyway, I can confer with Christoph, and then we can.
Yeah, no, there's no rush, no rush.
Okay. Well, I suppose the idea is I want that sort of sound frequency, lateral inhibition, and the relationship with corollary discharge, that sort of early development idea, that it happens early on in life, and not necessarily during kind of adulthood, because the coronary discharge obviously begins when we start talking. And I kind of want that relationship, if that makes sense. Like I want the beginning of our speech development and lateral inhibition and sound frequencies to be kind of related together, if that makes any sense.
Well, it makes sense, you know, in the following sense, that in order to listen properly, and also to speak properly, you would have to develop the right kind of machinery and the right kind of generative model that would entail having the right kind of lateral inhibition, the right kind of coronary discharge, the right kind of precision weighting of prediction errors in a predictive coding application to that generative model. And that would certainly entail learning, and that would certainly be a crucial aspect of neurodevelopment. And if we were talking about these mechanisms in the context of language acquisition and speech and reading, yeah, then you would know very precisely which critical neurodevelopmental periods were in question. That bit makes sense. So if I ask my question slightly more simply, are you just interested in telling a story about the neurodevelopmental imperatives that underlie our capacity to talk and to listen?
Yes, I suppose that's true. I suppose I'm trying to kind of highlight, because there hasn't been much research in terms of auditory lateral inhibition during kind of early development and its kind of relationship with speech development. I suppose that's the kind of relationship that I want to highlight. Like we should, I mean, not we, but you know, open the idea that kind of sound frequencies and lateral inhibition in early development, how do these potentially impact sound, you know, the way that we speak and coronary discharge during speaking, and whether there's a relationship between, you know, whether there's a relationship there, because there's, from my research, there's very minimal stuff out there.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's a very clear answer. And so one could paraphrase that by saying that I want to establish a theoretical framework that foregrounds the importance of lateral inhibition in shaping our contextualizing coronary discharge during language acquisition,
Yeah,
which means that I can now motivate a career as a developmental psychologist or physiologist, but also as a theoretician, studying this critical period of language acquisition, in sort of early infancy. So it's really motivating a theoretical framework that points to the importance of measuring, say, the ability, sort of feature ground segregation in auditory streams before and after the first word, or before and after you're getting the first 100 words, or indeed, right from right from birth. So I see. So it's really trying to identify. It's a story about the mechanisms of how we acquire the ability to communicate, to understand, to listen, and speak and talk in the auditory domain. Right, excellent. There was another answer you could have given me, though. You could have said, well, what I really want to do is to understand these mechanisms, not just in terms of how they underwrite our ability for this kind of sense making and action, but how they go wrong in psychopathology. And I'm particularly interested in autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as canonical examples of a failure of these kinds of mechanisms. And I want to do developmental psychology, but with developmental neuropsychology, with a special focus on conditions that seem to preclude a fully functional language acquisition and communication. And so, but you don't want to, at this stage, you don't want to do that. other than highlight potentially interesting psychopathologies or pathological conditions and diseases that would point to the important mechanisms?
To be honest, I mean, I'm just generally extremely passionate about the area. So like, you know, if someone came to me with a different perspective, I mean, I'm just very open to learning anything about the idea that I've kind of brought forward, because I'm just very passionate about it. And if someone came to me with a completely like the opposite, it sounds a bit strange, but if someone came to me with a totally opposite idea, I'd be like, oh wow, you know, that changes my perspective, and I can work on the kind of theory that's being developed.
Yeah, our job is not really to offer you alternative perspectives. It's to give you confidence and to help you winnow down on a sellable narrative and perspective that you can convince yourself and therefore other people this is the right thing to commit your. So I wasn't saying there's an alternative perspective. What I'm saying is you can just think about the basic neuroscience, neurobiology of this area and the key things you're interested in, which is the lateral inhibition and corollary discharge and active listening and active talking. Or you could say, you know, I'm going to take a neuropsychological perspective on the same issue, by which means neuropsychology is basically the study of structure function deficits. So you may say, yes, I can get at these mechanisms, not just by surveying the literature and thinking about it carefully, but actually say, well, let's now pick a condition in which this function is compromised and ask what could have caused that particular psychopathology or functional deficit. And that will give me a clue. But to do that, I have to look at all the evidence for retarded speech acquisition in conditions, or look at the conditions that have the particular developmental failures or delays, or indeed, as you say, represent a first hit for subsequent developmental problems later in life. So I'm not really saying it's an alternative perspective. I'm just saying that you could motivate this by just studying normal children, or you could motivate. You could say, well, what I really want to do is to compare normal children with a condition that entails the functional deficits that I'm interested in. And you could choose, say, Asperger's or autism. As I can't really think of any other. Going back to the question about psychosis, children don't get psychosis by definition until in their late teens, but they do have. But there are canonical syndromes such as autism or autistic spectrum disorder, which, if you like, can be read as a childhood schizophrenia. So that would be the natural thing you'd go to. You'd be asking, are the failures of precision weighting and sensory attenuation in autism the kind of thing I would predict would lead to delayed language acquisition, either in the critical developmental periods or in later life.
Sure.
So, I mean, well, let me ask you, what would you want to do? I mean, you could do both and just say, look, I have looked at the evidence in autism research, and it's all very consistent with this basic idea, this basic hypothesis, that you have to learn the right kind of lateral inhibition to pay attention to self-generated speech. And this is a key component of language acquisition and the ability to recognize speech.
Yeah, sure. So I was kind of thinking, because one area I had the idea is because schizophrenia does tend to be quite a genetic disease. Potentially researching the children of people who have gone on to get schizophrenia and seeing whether whether there's a corollary discharge and auditory lateral inhibition dysfunction during their development, and seeing when that relationship is there.
No, that's very clever. Yes, okay. You'd be going for sort of high risk children, basically, or yeah. So that would be a very nice example of a more neuropsychology approach, but slightly finessed or nuanced. But in fact, you're looking at high versus low risk people
Yeah,
based upon the schizophrenia research.
yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, you could also look at and you have that comparison with people who don't have a genetic risk in the family to see if there's that kind of relationship between healthier auditory processing in it sounds terrible, I don't mean it in that sense, but kind of healthy children, and kind of comparing those results with the children of more genetically susceptible to schizophrenia and whether kind of you can see that relationship there.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Right. Good. Well, so that clarifies the setting. So unlike Christoph, I don't take notes. I just get some papers I think you might be interested in on the screen. So and then so I don't have to take any notes. So I haven't lost my notes, but I have got all the papers I thought you might be interested in that would lend substance to your thesis. And you've probably read a lot of them. And if not, I think you'd enjoy reading them. And all they will do, I think, is just lend various supports to the central idea that you've been describing from different perspectives. So again, it's not offering different perspectives or alternatives for you to choose among. It's offering different perspectives on exactly the thing that you're talking about. Just to preview that, it sounds to me the simplest way of telling the story that you wanted to tell is going to be very explicitly on the precision weighting, possibly of prediction errors, but if you commit to a predictive coding formulation. But I think more generally, because there are other formulations such as belief updating and discrete state space generative models where you have belief propagation and message passing of a slightly different kind, but the same principle applies. Getting the precision of the mapping between your observable sensations and what caused those sensations right is absolutely crucial. And I think that's where everything you said fits together. And of course, it is important to, I think, realize that because the optimization of the precision of technically your likelihood mappings that map from cause, determine the most likely or sensed consequence of a latent cause, say a word, or you as a cause as opposed to somebody else in terms of attribution of agency. So that's generically referred to as a likelihood mapping, and it's a precision of this likelihood mapping that people talk about when they talk about sensory precision, for example. Now, getting that precision right is absolutely crucial from a number of perspectives. And I'm saying this because I know it's been recorded, so I would actually counsel you use the words that I'm using just so that you orientate your readers as to why it's so important to look at the things you want to look at. And then you can list the things you want to look at from different perspectives on the precision of this likelihood mapping, open brackets, aka also known as sensory precision, close brackets. From a computational perspective, it is absolutely crucial to balance the sensory evidence against your prior beliefs during learning and during inference and communication. Therefore, getting the precision right is essential for an optimal, indeed technically a Bayes optimal sense making in any context. And as a result of that, also Bayes optimal decision making when it comes to talking as opposed to listening. From a physiological perspective, it is generally thought that the precision is encoded biophysically in the gain of any neural populations reporting the sensory evidence. In a predictive coding scheme, these would be, for example, the superficial pyramidal cells reporting prediction errors. But that's just one example. The key thing is the excitability and the gain. Also in schizophrenia research understood in terms of excitation inhibition balance. So it's the sensitivity or the excitability of those neural populations, say tonotopically mapped representations in primary auditory cortex, for example, how excitable are they to their afferents, and how much do they fire away and then induce some kind of belief updating or perceptual synthesis at the next level in a particular in the auditory hierarchy. Having established that in the reader's mind, you say then, what are the key determinants of this excitability? Well, we're talking about anything that can modulate excitability. So when we're talking effectively about a causal stream that generally will start with ascending modulatory neurotransmitter systems. Common examples of these include dopamine, you already mentioned that. In early development, you could also argue that oxytocin is an important neuromodulator, particularly in the context of things like autism, for example. In the auditory domain, the sort of the canonical modulatory neurotransmitter is generally thought to be acetylcholine or cholinergic. And in particular, that which modulates these likelihood mappings or sensory sensory precisions. However, it's not sufficient just to say, oh, I've got a bad cholinergic neurotransmission. How is that mediated? You've already discussed with Christoph the potential importance of NMDA receptor dysfunction or function in setting the gain right. So as soon as you were talking about getting the gain right, you're normally talking about neuromodulatory effects where you're changing the conductance, but not the depolarization of cells that are reporting various sources of evidence, which usually invokes voltage-dependent NMDA receptors, but where? So the most of them live on inhibitory interneurons, and in particular the targets of, say, top-down predictions would be your VIP, visospinal peptide expressing interneurons. And there's going to be, indeed, there is an emerging canonical microcircuit of inhibitory interneurons. So using the three optogenetic classes, where you get sort of disinhibition, so top-down predictions through sort of a relief of disinhibition can explain away the in the predictive coding context what's going on at the level below. But crucially, that degree of disinhibition mediated by inhibitory interneurons, and implicitly the lateral inhibition mediated by local inhibitory interneurons, depends upon an NMDA receptor function. So it can be modulated. So most of the NMDA receptors are on these inhibitory interneurons. So now what you've done is you've told the reader that this computational mechanism, physiologically speaking, entails the modulatory control of lateral inhibition and the interactions both between different populations of inhibitory interneurons in different lamina of the cortex, but also the things that they are interacting with, which would be the pyramidal cells. So you've now got the modulation of lateral inhibition in play. You've also said implicitly that the important targets of certainly the VIP interneurons are descending corollary discharge like projections. So you've immediately got you're starting to get all your key players into the story, and you can elaborate that. And there's a lot of interesting work which I'm sure you've already found, which says, well, what are the electrophysiological correlates of modulating lateral inhibition read as setting the overall excitation inhibition balance right through modulating inhibitory interneurons, and that's usually in terms of the frequencies that they express, and then you get into the realm of fast spiking interneurons and something called synchronous gain. So if you, another expression of this increase in the gain as you increase the precision or you modulate the precision, is that everything falls into fast synchrony, and that effectively enables now the gathering together of spikes to increase the sensitivity for any given number of spikes, simply because everything's synchronized and the temporal windows of depolarization are just right. So that notion of synchronous gain immediately tells you if everything's working properly, you should have fast induced induced fast oscillations in the gamma range, and if it's not working properly, you'd expect those not to be there. And indeed, you can go to schizophrenia, and then there's a whole literature by people like Peter Olhouse and John Lisman Lisman in America, who talk about the electrophysiological correlates of this, usually failure of lateral inhibition as mediated by inhibitory interneurons. So there's lots of stuff you could unpack there. But now let's turn to the psychology. So that's the physiology of it, as expressed in terms of the synaptic modulation and synaptic dynamics, right through to the electrophysiological non-invasive measures with EEG and MEG and the like. But the psychology version of this, high precision means selective attention. That's basically what you've been talking about. You've been saying selectively selecting this retinotopically mapped auditory response by increasing the gain here and through a lateral inhibition-like effect, sometimes known as representational sharpening, decreasing the precision of all the other potentially competing explanations for the belief updating higher in the system. So that psychologically we can really equate this modulation of precision with selective attention. But selective attention comes with what you haven't selected, and of course that's the other side of the coin, and that would be at the sensory level, sensory attenuation. So I think it'd be important to get these two sides of the coin in the reader's mind. The thing you are interested in studying the neurodevelopment of is effectively selective attention and sensory attenuation during critical periods of language acquisition, as mediated by inhibitory interneurons in the auditory hierarchy. Once you've got that in play, you can then start to talk about all the empirical experimental domains that you've addressed, because at the moment we haven't talked about attribution of agency, we haven't talked about schizophrenia, we haven't talked about hallucinations, we haven't talked about the force matching illusion. But you have to, I think, pick carefully now, well, what does it mean? If I think this key mechanism rests upon the ability to deploy endogenous or exogenous selective attention in auditory processing, and or to attenuate at the appropriate time that gain in the spirit of sensory attenuation, what does that mean for the kind of things that I would want to measure or for the functionalities I want to explain? So selective attention would be absolutely one, and you give some really nice examples of picking out, for example, in the cocktail party effect, or picking out in the sense that in a noisy environment, and there's quite a lot of work on this, not in early neurodevelopment, but aging research and late neurodevelopment, as you lose the ability to record very precise information about auditory.
Yeah, that's kind of a lot. That's the thing that's kind of frustrated me in a way, because there's so much research about in the elderly population, but there's like almost none at all in the young, and that's like the most important part, like not most important part, but like in terms of speech development, like
yes,
it's interesting to think, well, if we're children and we can't effectively distinguish words and sounds and stuff as well, like surely that impacts kind of the way that we develop our speech and that sort of thing. So yeah,
absolutely, yeah. And it addresses not just the ongoing mechanisms and their failure in neurodegeneration, for example, but the crucial issue of acquisition and learning these mechanisms in the first place. Yeah. The point I was trying to get across was in the aging research, is you can sort of fill in the gaps when you don't hear, when you don't get very precise sensory information by increasing the precision of your prior beliefs. So this might be an important point at which to introduce. It's not just about the sensory precision, it's how precise your likelihood mapping is in relation to your prior beliefs and deeper levels in the auditory hierarchy. So, it is the balance that is generally thought to be important, not just the precision in and of itself. But once you've got sensory attenuation in the game, you can then start to expand your story beyond language acquisition. Because at the moment, is acquiring and understanding speech. It's got nothing to do with producing and generating speech. But as soon as you move into generating speech, you're now in the world of active inference and active sensing and action. So what does it mean? What do you need to do in order to act? Well, you need to ignore the evidence that you're not acting. So this is where sensory attenuation gets into the game, and it's a much simpler explanation than that which you would have read about in Sarah Blakemore and Chris Frith's early accounts that Christoph was talking about. So these early accounts of why you can't tickle yourself, or the force matching illusion, why you don't hear yourself speak in the same way that you hear somebody else speak. So this, the sort of vernacular expression of this. Well, I can predict what I'm saying, therefore I can cancel the inputs that I'm hearing if I generate it myself, and therefore it doesn't matter. That doesn't work as an explanation for many reasons. You can get this kind of effect even during silence in terms of omission-like paradigms. What does work as a much better explanation is exactly what you were intimating before, which was the sensory attenuation. So when I know I'm going to move, I now can reduce the precision of all the consequences of that movement during the action. So this means that when I speak, I can reflexively reduce the precision of the auditory feedback of the consequences of me speaking. So I'm sending down from a generative modeling or predictive processing perspective. When I am speaking, I am sending down two kinds of predictions. One kind of prediction is being sent to the not the ocular motor, the vocal machinery, my voice box, and it's proprioceptive predictions about the sequences of things I would feel in my voice box in order to produce the right kinds of sounds. And then I let my reflexes do the movements to fulfill those predictions. So that's, sort of reflexive kind of active inference or equipping predictive coding with reflex arcs. And then I'm making another kind of descending prediction, which is the sensory consequences of that saying that word. And that's what you are referred to as corollary discharge. It's also known as efference copy, but with a subtle distinction. So if you go to the Wikipedia page and try and work out what the differences between corollary discharge and efference copy, you will confuse yourself. So I've given up trying to do that.
I'm just sort of with the efference copy, because recently I read that the efference, it's quite confusing. Is the efference copy like prediction, and the corollary discharge is like the cancelling, if that makes sense?
No, I can imagine
I've read so much.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to understand people's description.
And no one seems to say the same thing at all.
Yeah, they don't, and it is very confusing. So after a few years, you just tend to ignore it. Efference copy, corollary discharge, they're exactly the same thing. They're just the predictions of the sensory, usually exteroceptive consequences of movement. Okay. So if it's in vision, it's a prediction of what you will see next after you've moved your eyes. If it's in speech, it's a prediction of the auditory consequences of making a noise. If it's in somatosensation, it's predicting what I feel when I move my fingers and palpate things. So they're all words for the same thing, but there's so much literature that people have got very confused about the exact terminology, and whether they go with Sperry or whether they go with somebody else's.
I feel quite comforted by that, because like I see these people and it's like they're from Harvard and they don't know, so I'm gonna take comfort from that.
Yes. Well, I'm sure they know. It's just that they're trying to be courteous to a literature before there was this much more simple understanding, which was only really brought to the table this century of predictive processing. You just got this one representation a word is being said. If a word is being said, that means I'm predicting all the motor behavior that will underwrite the saying of that word and all the consequences that attend that, including, the proprioceptive, the somatosensory, and the auditory cortex. And all of these is just descending predictions. You can just divide them into descending proprioceptive predictions and descending exteroceptive, and you can call this one corollary discharge because it's a corollary to the motor one, or it's a copy, so it's an efference and output copy from some generator. It really doesn't matter. So if you just stick to simple language and try not to, or just in brackets out of courtesy, so sometimes in the historical literature this was referred to as corollary discharge, or and if you get really into it, you get something called reafference copy, which
I've done that. I was like, but isn't that the same as a corollary discharge?
It's just a mess. Anyway, it's not a mess, but it's just a distraction. It's a distraction from the much simpler story, which offered by predictive processing or predictive coding. And the importance of keeping it simple is it can get quite complicated, because now, if I've just got one generative model process generating a word being said, I can use that in two modes depending upon when I deploy my sensory attenuation. So if I deploy my sensory attenuation and I ignore all the evidence that it is me, or ignore all the evidence that I'm not actually speaking yet, then the prediction errors in the proprioceptive domain are forced to turn back and drive the muscles and cause me to speak. And that speech actually generates auditory input, but that auditory input is now attenuated because I've had to switch off and attenuate all the consequences of action while I am acting. So I don't hear it in quite the same way. I don't attend to it. I ignore effectively my own speech while I am generating it. So that means that you can use it in the generative mode to actually generate motor action and to speak. And then once you've spoken, you can stop. You can then switch off the sensory attenuation, and namely, you can start attending again. But as you're attending, you're now attending to this proprioceptive discharge, which says, "Oh, you're not moving. Fine, I'm listening," and I'm now attending to the auditory input, so I can now attend to you. And of course, I can use exactly the same generative model to generate the predictions of the word that I would have said if I was talking that you are now. Now I can use effectively, in the spirit of a mirror neuron, my top-down predictions to explain what you are saying, and I can use a prediction as to infer the word that you are saying. So at this point, of course, it's no longer corollary discharge, but it's exactly the same neurons and exactly the same predictions, which is why I say don't worry about corollary discharge. It's I think it's a slight misdirection, which was before people understood predictive processing in the brain.
Talking about lateral inhibition, it just feels like I have no lateral inhibition, and everyone's interpretation is just like going going everywhere. But no, I appreciate that. It's very helpful knowing that, because it is quite complex, and the more times you read the same thing, the less you believe it in a way.
Right. The lateral inhibition, I think I would just read as synonymous with the representational sharpening that comes along with the right kind of precision weighting. And notice that the representational sharpening has both the selective attention, the increase in the precision in the right domain, and the attenuation in the wrong domain. So you've got both both sides of increases and decreases of selective deployment of precision. That comes along in parallel from the actual content that's been predicted. So the corollary discharge itself, the predictions of the sensory consequences of an act, for example, that's the content. It's not the precision. The precision also has to be predicted, and that prediction is mediated by the lateral inhibition. In your story, you could say getting the excitation inhibition balance right. You could say getting the postsynaptic gain right, or the Kalman gain right, or the attentional gain right, but they would be ultimately mediated by inhibitory interneurons. Just a little note here: lateral inhibition is a description of a phenomena in electrophysiology, usually associated with center surround organizations. It can also be confused with the activity of lateral connections. So lateral connections are those connections usually in a hierarchy that connect to the same level of the hierarchy that are distinct from horizontal connections, which are usually constrained to within the white matter. So there's a whole terminological minefield out there which you should avoid. So if by lateral inhibition you just mean local inhibitory mechanisms that are setting the right gain control for this particular bit of cortical processing that I'm going to read in terms of getting the precision right, I think you'll be absolutely fine. You could argue, and there are people, including Raphael Bogarts in Oxford, that horizontal connections in the early visual cortex are those things that gather the information together to locally adjust the precision in the spirit of endogenous attention. So if you imagine just taking the local prediction errors, and they're all a little bit high, and if I gather them together through my lateral interactions, I can say, oh, hang on, my estimate of the precision was too high in this instance. Sorry, it was too low in this. My estimate of precision now needs to be decreased because the evidence suggests that I got imprecise data because I got lots of unpredictable high precision errors. So you get this local precision control mediated by horizontal lateral interactions within the cortex. So this is not the kind that would be predicted through top-down connections or from the pulvinar or mediated by these ascending neuromodulated transmitters. These are a different kind of endogenous attention where you know, because this is the right context, that this kind of information is going to be very precise and that information is not, where you're in charge of or certainly able to recognize the context that would specify the precision. This is a much simpler kind of precision control where just on the basis of what you can predict, you know that this is unpredictable, it's imprecise, and therefore I'm going to reduce the precision from this part of the cortex so these prediction errors don't have too much effect elsewhere. It's probably an unnecessary amount of detail, but it does bring into play horizontal connections that mediate the lateral inhibition in a center surround like aspect in retinotopically or tonotopically mapped cortex. But if I were you, I'd just generalize that notion, just say that, you know, when I talk about lateral inhibition, what I basically mean is a local inhibitory aspect of neuronal self-organization, which sets the local excitability or sensitivity or gain of this population to be optimal in terms of selecting or attenuating the evidence accumulation or the assimilation of sensory evidence to pass up to the next level in the hierarchy. Where were we? Yeah. So what I'm trying to say, and I think what you should try to say here, that sensory attenuation, which is one aspect of this, one key aspect of modulating the precision or the lateral interactions, is not only really important for understanding attribution of agency in schizophrenia and delusions and hallucinations. Without it, you couldn't move. You know, you have to ignore the fact you're not moving before you can move. And if you couldn't do that, you'd be Parkinsonic, for example.
Yeah.
So it's really important that ability to modulate the lateral inhibition or the to implement sensory attenuation at the right time. My favorite example is saccadic suppression. So when you move your eyes, you can't see the optic flow. You only see what after you've moved your eyes. So, you know, the saccadic suppression is one example of the sensory attenuation of an automatic non-volitional sort that you see in the visual domain as opposed to the auditory domain. And it may well be that sensory attenuation during speech has a very similar role. You know, you can't cognitively penetrate it, you can't listen to yourself. You can use, you didn't mention it, but there are interesting paradigms where you get delays in your self-vocalization. You introduce the delay in the loop. And that sort of breaks the symmetry, as it were, and you can get, and it's almost impossible to speak when you hear yourself delayed by 300 milliseconds, simply because you've now eluded this automatic sensory attenuation. And there are people who think that stuttering is a pathology of this. So that's another pathology that you might want to look into. You know, when do people develop the ability to stutter, or when did they develop stuttering? And the idea is it's a failure of sensory attenuation, that they hear themselves and stop talking because they hear themselves.
That's very interesting. And like in terms of the age and development, that sort of thing, I think it's quite interesting that when lateral inhibition, I mean, it could be just coincidence, but it's also helpful to kind of show that when auditory lateral inhibition matures is at the same time that people's inner voices become more prominent. And so we're more able to identify as when we're ourselves and identify our inner voice as being a part of our representation of ourselves and being able to kind of have that sense of agency. So I think that might be an interesting kind of connection.
Oh, well, yeah, and that would be the next step in your sort of laying out your story before you go into all the technical details and all the empirical references, and then that's that part of attribution of agency, both, you know, simply in terms of things like the mirror neuron system enabling the way that you generate actions and vocalizations, means that that's a perfectly apt model to now infer somebody else generating the same kinds of things. All you need to do is to work out, did you do that or did I do that? So just in normal communication, we're doing this attribution of agency all the time. Whose turn is it to talk? Because if it's my turn, I attenuate all my consequences of talking, and I just let my predicted voice muscle signals be reflexively fulfilled, and I talk, and then I switch the other mode. I'm listening. I'm not going to listen now, but I will listen in a moment. And then how could that go wrong? And that's exactly the Chris Frith story that you're alluding to. Sorry, that would inherit from inner voices. So if I've now got an inner voice, which is just basically the intention to say a particular phrase, then if I am not able to attenuate, I'll actually hear myself talking. And that means that's going to be confusing because I've never heard myself talk before. So therefore, if I can hear myself talk because there's been a failure of sensory attenuation, somebody else must be talking. And of course, so you can now understand auditory hallucinations as a failure to attribute agency simply because you've lost the ability to do the sensory attenuation. So this notion of a failure of sensory attenuation is a really common theme right through from autism right through to schizophrenia, covers everything, including sort of well, even chronic pain, obsessional compulsive disorder. You'll find many explanations rest upon effectively, I repeat, a primary failure of sensory attenuation, but more generally, a failure to modulate the lateral inhibition in a context-sensitive way.
And I think it's a lot of interesting research I found is on tinnitus, and how auditory lateral inhibition is being used to help reduce the kind of concentration of tinnitus, because it kind of helps to really emphasize the contrast between the sounds and then know which sound to stop or to reduce, which is helpful in tinnitus. So I think that's quite interesting. I mean, even though tinnitus is supposedly a sound, but we just interpret it more like excited inhibitory kind of balance. We don't have the inhibition to the sounds that are being produced. I think that's a really kind of interesting connection. Sounds that aren't there.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, of course, yes. What is a sound? Is it the sound that you perceive or the waves in the air?
That's the thing.
Yeah, I think Will Sedley has written about that quite a lot. It's a colleague of mine, Will Sedley, Sedley, precisely pursuing that. I haven't got that paper up, but I could have, should have done. And that's another. That's not quite. I think that is an important thing to mention, certainly as an interesting another aspect of the pathology of lateral inhibition or precision weighting or selective attention or sensory attenuation in the auditory domain. It doesn't have the glorious aspect, though, of explaining auditory hallucinations and delusions in schizophrenia. And why is there such an important link between this sensory attenuation and agency and sight and delusions?
In terms of the tinnitus thing, I was thinking more that being able to like effectively like inhibit sounds, like that could help. Yeah, during, as I was thinking, like during the development, being able to know precisely what sounds are self-generated and what sounds are externally generated.
I see. Yes.
But yeah, no, I agree.
Okay, so we've done. Yeah, I think that's that's the denouement of your story. That ultimately this failure to modulate, i.e., selectively attend or attenuate precision, can have profound consequences all the way through to failures of attribution of agency and devastating psychotic experiences. But there's a lot of other stuff going along the way. We've covered. If you'll indulge me, I'll just quickly go through the papers that sort of. If you haven't read, I repeat, you might enjoy reading from usually our work that just provides a worked example, usually a simulation or a treatment of the points that we've just been rehearsing. I'll just go through it quickly because I can imagine you're getting tired now, and I know it's been recorded so that you can go back to the to the screen. Good. Hopefully you'll be able to see me. Yeah. So Christoph found the original paper by Sarah Jane Blakemore and Chris Frith. That paper, which I think, Christoph, was that the tickling yourself paper? I can't.
Yeah, it was, and I realized also another one that I found my notes. Just another one with a force matching task was the Shergill 2005, which I just really liked.
Yes, absolutely, and that's the one that I've got here. So this is Suki Shergill.
Oh yeah.
So just for Christoph, your entertainment as well. So that's sort of tickling yourself. So Sarah was Chris's PhD student, Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's now an FRS and one of the world's experts in developmental.
Right. That's so interesting.
And then Chris at that time had this notion that if I couldn't attenuate my inner voice and I heard myself speaking, then that would lead to failures of agency and auditory hallucinations. So that's where this story came from. And the tickling yourself paradigm was what Sarah did. And then down at King's. So the reason I put this up is that this was these were studies done at KCL. In collaboration. Oh, in fact, Sarah's not on this one. But
I'm just going to quickly turn on a light before I just fall into darkness.
All right.
Okay, so.
Oh, that's impossible. He was King's. Oh no, there he is. So he was, interested in psychiatry at King's College London. So Lucy, I'm putting that up because Suk is a friend of mine and he may well still be around, so you should say hello to him. But this is the force matching paradigm done by colleagues at KCL as a follow-up to the Sarah's and Chris's work. So a beautiful piece of work in schizophrenia. That was followed up theoretically in a paper. Oh dear me, where are we? Let me just quickly go through these. So that's a follow-up paper that Christoph had in mind. This paper, I'm afraid I'm not going to do this in order because I can't find the right order. But I'll just tell you why I thought these papers might be interesting for you. This particular paper is a purely theoretical paper that shows the importance of being able to pick out the right signals in terms of abstracting figure from ground. This illustration of simulation was in the visual domain, but exactly the same principles apply in the auditory domain in terms of this representational sharpening and picking out the right combination of frequencies that underwrite a phoneme when you are able to identify the gestalt in terms of the precision, and recognize and thereby selectively amplify or attend to the right frequencies, or in this instance the right spatial locations. So in this instance, the source of the the control of the lateral inhibition was the pulvina, and it just takes you through the maths of the role of these inhibitory interneurons or lateral interactions in scoring the local precision in terms of accumulated prediction errors in a predictive coding scheme, and illustrating using numerical studies how one can sort of pick out and recognize certain features in noisy backgrounds. So that's just a computational verification or validation of this notion of processing that was subsequently used in a more heuristic way in a small commentary or review about predictive coding, just to highlight the importance of lateral interactions in mediating this representational sharpening that all rests upon this computational, the computational role of encoding precision or uncertainty when picking out the right sources of evidence for your evidence accumulation or predictive coding. So you will hopefully find some useful references here for this picture of lateral inhibition and picking out the right things. This paper I put in deliberately because right at the end, if I remember correctly, it has quite an in-depth no, I've got the wrong one. My greatest apologies. This is right. Okay.
But that is interesting in terms of like repetition, suppression, and adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. So
inhibition sort of helps to kind of jump out from adaptation, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, and this gentleman did some of the best work in this area using dynamic causal modeling and EEG mismatch negativity paradigms. The paper I was hoping to find, though, actually had a diagram showing the 3 types of inhibitory interneurons that you mentioned, just to explain how attention might be mediated in the mismatch negativity paradigm under predictive coding. So I'm afraid you'll have to do your own foraging for the. So it's the same. It's Riziard and Carl doing it, but it must have been a later one. But this one just takes you through the basic principles, as you rightly point out, focusing on the precision and the precision weighting and estimates of precision and how they can sort of obliterate a mismatch response if you have a failure of the sensory attenuation, exactly as you were describing. But irritatingly, it doesn't have the inhibitory interneurons. Which never mind. Okay.
I think I know what you're talking about, because there's the 5-HT3A, I think, and then the somatostatin, and then the.
That's right. Yeah.
I think I've read it before.
Yeah. Excellent. Good. So we've done that one. That was the one showing the representational sharpening in the visual cortex, and that's the Christoph's force matching paradigm. This is, you may well have come across this lady, Emma Holmes, has done a lot of the aging research in terms of auditory speech perception and the importance of attention. I just put it up because you were talking a lot about sort of phonemes and selective attention, or being able to make sense of noisy stimuli. And if I remember properly, this paper spends quite a lot of time changing the priors about what phonemes are going to come next given your prior beliefs about what is being said relative to the precision of the actual primary auditory encoding, the primary sensory input, and showing that how
like sound formants, because with like vowels and that sort of thing, being able to there's some research about being able to recognize certain frequencies and vowels and stuff like that.
Absolutely, and that's why I put this up, just to as a numerical study of the importance of recognizing formants of a particular kind, and specifically the relative precision afforded to the formant level relative to, say, a lexical level. And it just goes through by showing manipulating the prior. So I'm just wondering if there are any formants. Yeah, I got. Yeah, so here's sort of various representations of formants. There should be a frequency. There we go. This is quite a detailed analysis using predictive coding of the kind of perceptual analysis that you were talking about at this level. That also allows you to refer to the importance of getting the precision right. So, you know, that's why I'm putting this paper up, as you know, even in very detailed accounts of auditory processing. At the end of the day, it's getting the precision right, or the lateral inhibition right, which is you know, the important thing for speech recognition, and what indeed you do. Oh, right. So this paper. And just to say that Emma has written about this in the context of the cocktail party problem. You can go through. I'm sure you've read that. So that's Emma Holmes' selective attention in this instance, focusing on the positive attribution of precision and the cocktail party problem here. The application. Well, where are we? Let's look at this one. Yeah, this is the paper that was written at roughly the same time, or shortly after the tickling yourself and the force matching illusion papers were written, just to get in play the notion of sensory attenuation as a reflection of getting the precision right.
I'd just like to interfere with my lateral inhibition obsession. That somatosensory lateral inhibition is like when you touch yourself, like the sensation, like excited, you feel the sensation of an excited neuron, and then around it is the sort of inhibited one, so that you can feel the sensation of your touch. So lateral inhibition plays a role in tickling yourself.
All right. Yeah, so that's yeah, so that's more of the center surround kind of lateral inhibition. Yeah. And you know, I think would be read as the implicit representational sharpening you get if with this distributed deployment of precision in the center and attenuation on the outside. I've been talking about lateral inhibition in a slightly more generic way, just basically getting the excitability right everywhere. You know, which will entail some bits of any mapped representation being more excited and others being less excitable. The reason I do that is that not all perceptual spaces are mapped. If we think about olfaction, for example, there's no notion of a lateral inhibition. It's just the smell of the moment, and everything else is not, you know, is inhibited inhibited. But the mechanism, you know, the mechanism should be the same. But in this instance, yeah. So this is the takes you through the evidence and the arguments for understanding the sensory attenuation, understanding the force matching illusion from the perspective of sensory attenuation, and I'm pretty sure it actually simulates the force matching illusion later on as an illustration of that. It's a picture of somebody pressing. Oh, that's a shame. There was a nice picture of somebody pressing themselves on you, or you pressing yourself on people. So this is a simulation of the force matching illusion, but it should have some interesting references in terms of where it came from with the sort of sensory attenuation story for schizophrenia. I've just put this paper up just because it was written with Chris Frith, and what this does, it just shows how two birds can talk to each other if and only if they engage sensory attenuation, selective attention in synchrony to do the right kind of turn taking. So this is a fundamental role of sensory attenuation, selective attention in setting the context that is especially important in turn taking in communication. So and just takes you through the sort of the basic principles behind that. And then all of this was summarized in Rick Adams' paper, which is, I presume you have read because you were talking about blunted mismatch responses, where he simulates these. He describes all of these things in terms of in this example. Well, he introduces a number of examples, but he also applies this to slow pursuit movements in schizophrenia research. Here's the yes, and then this is the force matching illusion, and then simulates the mismatch and negativity, I hope. I'm sure he did. Yes, so he simulates the attenuation of a mismatch negativity and failures of sensory attenuation, and how exactly the same mechanism then explains the failures of slow pursuit and prediction in schizophrenia, and then how the same mechanism can explain the resistance to the force matching illusion that Suki Shergill was describing. So this might be a good summary paper. So it means you don't have to read any of the other papers. But just to conclude, what I'm to repeat, I'm interpreting lateral inhibition as the generic suppression or augmentation of local responses that may or may not have a spatially structured or mapped center surround structure. So when you talk about lateral inhibition, if you mean something very specific about the centers activated and the surround is disactivated, that is a particular instance of the more generic and universal way I was using lateral inhibition as intrinsic inhibitory mechanisms within a particular local microcircuit to get the right kind of message passing.
No, I did understand that.
Right.
Well,
Right, so that's all I've got to say. I said far too much.
No, that's been extremely helpful, and I really appreciate it. And I don't know, I was expecting people probably to drop off halfway, so I appreciate very much that you listened to me and very much helped me.
Amazing. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for joining, everyone. Also, Lucy, first of all, another quick, small round of applause for your presentation, Lucy. Thank you very much for that. I don't want to destroy the beautiful nuance that Carl has brought into the papers, but I will just share some papers via email that I thought were interesting just when I read into this, but they might not be as targeted as towards what we were precisely talking about, but still I found them very interesting when I started reading into the topic. Also by Rick Adams, some cool stuff. So yeah, thanks again so much, Lucy, for your presentation. Thank you very much, Carl, for your extensive discussion. And yeah, then I think we can wrap it up here. Look very much forward to seeing you at the next TNB meeting, which will be on Monday, chaired by Riddy. And I will leave everyone with that. Thank you so much for joining. Have a lovely afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks so much, Lucy.